Hello, human geographers. We are back at it again for our final lecture tonight, and we're going to be talking about low-income areas around the world. So, we're going to start the lecture. The first half of the lecture, we'll be talking about low-income areas and MDCs, and then we'll shift to low-income areas and LDCs. So, this is just a quick snapshot of some of the things that we're going to be talking about tonight. So, I'll introduce LDCs right now, and then we'll come back to that later. The lowest income areas in LDCs are what we call squatter settlements. These typically are found on the periphery of cities, on the outside of the cities, what we would probably call the suburbs. But remember that in most areas of the world, the suburbs are the lowest income areas, whereas in the United States and Anglo-America and a few other places, they're the highest income areas. So, these squatter settlements are typically found on the periphery of cities. And here's the definition. An area within a city, again, typically on the periphery, in a less developed country in which people illegally establish residences on land they do not own or rent and erect homemade structures. So we're going to be talking about that later, and I think more important than that, I'll be showing you some images of squatter settlements later. On the flip side, and what we will start our lecture with tonight, are MDCs. And so we're going to talk about some of the different things that are happening in MDCs, in low-income areas and MDCs. But here are some of the characteristics that a lot of times we see in the lowest income areas. In those low-income areas, based on the models that we've looked at and just based on trends that we see in particular in Anglo-America, but in the low-income areas around the world for MDCs. In Anglo-America, they tend to be in the inner city. And we see higher rates of unemployment, largely because a lot of the people there lack skills, the skills that are necessary to get a job. And that might be, especially now in a more globalized world, that might be computer skills. And where do we tend to learn those skills? Well, we learn those in schools. And a lot of times in the inner city, the schools are more run down, they're older, they haven't been kept up to date, they don't have the most up-to-date materials, textbooks, computers, to learn the skills that might be necessary in the employment world. And so, then the question might be, well, why are the schools run down? Well, we're going to talk about that on the next slide. But it largely comes down to the fact that the tax base has diminished. So we're going to come back to that. We tend to see higher rates of alcoholism and drug use and drug addiction. We tend to see higher rates of juvenile delinquency and crime. Again, because the tax base has eroded. And that tax base, a lot of times, the tax money, that tax revenue, is used to pay for teachers, schools, police officers, to enforce these laws and help teach the children of the inner city skills. And so if that tax base isn't there, then it's hard to make sure that everything is being kept up to the standard that we set. And we also tend to see more public housing, which we'll talk about a little bit later today. So let's kind of explain how that works and kind of tie all of the previous slide together. And so what we've noticed in the past of U.S. history, is that more affluent families left the inner city for the suburbs. We largely saw this after World War II. Part of the reason was dual income households, the mass production of automobiles, mass production of single-family detached homes, which made all of these more affordable for typically affluent families, okay? Or even now middle-class families. And so the middle class and the more affluent families left the cities and moved out to the suburbs. And these families were largely white, and so this was labeled as white flight. We covered that in our ethnicity unit. Now, as people leave, that tax base diminishes. Typically what we see is that the more people pay, the more people earn, the more people typically pay in taxes. It's called a progressive tax system. And so what we see is as those more affluent families leave, so too does their tax revenue, what they pay in taxes. It goes out to the suburbs with them. So they're paying it out in the suburbs. It might be a different county if we're talking about a metropolitan statistical area, or it just might be a different municipality, whatever it might be. As that tax base diminishes, you have less tax revenue coming in, and you have families that are lower income and thus might pay a little less in taxes, which means that there's less tax revenue to spend on maintaining schools, updating schools, making sure they have the newest textbook, the newest technology, hiring experienced teachers, hiring more police officers, hiring people that serve in government and provide those services. And so then what ends up happening is cities have become the center of poverty in MDCs. And typically, one example that we could look at are brownfields. And especially in the Rust Belt, this is going to be more characteristic. A brownfield is a former industrial or commercial site that is underused, vacant, or abandoned, where there is the potential for environmental contamination. Now, these are areas that, as people have left to the suburbs, have been vacated, have been left alone. And those jobs have followed people out to the suburbs, and so these areas remain vacant or underused at the very least. So let's take a look. This is a brownfield in western Pennsylvania, a former industrial site. And I mentioned that brownfields might be especially more prominent in the Rust Belt, where there were industrial jobs, but due to deindustrialization, those industrial jobs have left. And these areas have shifted to more of a tertiary sector economy. So, a couple of questions, see if we can predict, you think like geographers, things like that. Since this is in western Pennsylvania and is an industrial site, what city do you think this is likely in and around? It's in western Pennsylvania. And thus, what industry do you think this is most likely associated with? Think of what city it was likely a part of, and then what was the basic industry for that city. Let's see if we can think like geographers. So put your predictions down. All right, so now let's talk about a couple of different elements here that have influenced the changing dynamic in the inner city. So as more affluent families left, those homes that they were living in were vacated. And this leads to a process called filtering. Here's the definition. The process in which more prosperous families, we've said affluent, move out of older housing and into newer housing, creating a vacancy which is filled by families that are less wealthy. So, here's the thing. Students have struggled in the past with the difference between filtering and gentrification. Here's kind of a very basic, and maybe overly basic, but here's a basic way to remember. Filtering is the opposite of gentrification. Filtering is the decline in a house or housing unit over time. All right. So what happens is that affluent family moves out, they move into a newer home in a different part of the city or out in the suburbs. That home over time, because it's been around, breaks down. And if it's not maintained, then families move in, and as it deteriorates, people move out, and a less affluent family moves in, a lower income family moves in, and eventually it gets to the point where it might just be abandoned. Nobody lives there. And when this happens at a large scale, the city begins to decay. So how can we improve that? Well, through investment, through a lot of different things. However, there's been a process in the past called redlining, where it was almost impossible for this to be improved. So here's what redlining is. A discriminatory real estate practice in North America in which members of minority groups are prevented from obtaining money to purchase homes or property in predominantly white neighborhoods. Today, this practice is officially illegal. And what made it illegal was the Community Reinvestment Act. And the Community Reinvestment Act required banks to keep track of what census tracts their investments went to. So they had to make sure that they weren't intentionally discriminating against areas where people of color or minority groups were trying to move into. Now, we can make a connection to this or make a connection between redlining and a term that we introduced back in our ethnicity unit, blockbusting. Remember that blockbusting was when real estate agents would try to scare white families into selling their homes before minority families moved into the neighborhood, trying to convince them that property values would decline, a practice which is very clearly unethical. All right? And just like redlining, blockbusting, and those types of practices have been outlawed. They can't do them anymore. So as those white families moved out, white flight, to the suburbs, filtering took place. Okay? Less wealthy families moved in, lower income families moved in. And then banks would eventually draw lines around areas that they would not invest in. So how can you improve a house that is having problems? Things need to be repaired. A water heater bursts, a pipe burst. You want to make some improvement in the house. So you take out a loan, but what if the bank says, no, we're sorry, we're not going to loan to you in that neighborhood? So the city begins to decay as a result. So let's take a look at a real life example of this. This is a map of Charlotte, North Carolina. And what you can see here, and I know in your notes, because it's copied here at school, it's just in black and white. But what you can see on the screen here are the areas that were quite literally drawn in red. Areas that banks would not invest in. And again, these were areas where minority groups were moving in, that were occupied by people of color. And if we go back to our ethnicity unit and try and remember what group of people, what ethnic minority was living largely in North Carolina and the southeast part of the country, and this disproportionately affected African Americans. And so we can see from this image that the banks would quite literally draw in red areas that they would not invest in, which now is illegal. It was unethical before. It's illegal now. They cannot do this. So now let's shift to public housing, because if you can't afford to buy your own house and the bank is refusing to lend to you and things like that, hey, there has to be another alternative. So one thing that we can talk about now is public housing. Public housing, by definition, is housing that is owned by the government. In the United States, it is rented to residents with lower incomes, and the rents are set at 30% of the family's income. Or it may be set around 30%, it might be 28.5% or 27%. It may depend, but it's right around 30% of the family's income. And a lot of times a term that you will hear utilized with regards to public housing is Section 8, Section 8 housing. And what Section 8 refers to when somebody says Section 8, they're referring to Section 8 of the Housing Act of 1937. And specifically in that section, it dealt with the Housing Choice Voucher Program that was established and created and is run by the Department of Housing and Urban Development. And really what the Housing Choice Voucher Program does is it helps with rent assistance. And we tend to see public housing and Section 8 housing clustered in the inner city, in lower income areas. Now, even in the inner city, it only constitutes about 1% of the U.S. population. Whereas if we were to compare public housing in another MDC, like the United Kingdom, it constitutes 14% of the population. But in the United Kingdom, it's not just low income. There's a whole host of people that are able to qualify for public housing or public housing assistance. They are low income. They can be single mothers, people who are disabled or handicapped. There's several different groups that qualify for public housing in the United Kingdom, whereas in the United States, it's really just low income. And those rents are set at a place that it's not going to be disproportionately too high relative to their income, because it's set at around 30% of their income. Now we have tended to see less money devoted towards public housing in the United States. And so we want to back that up with some evidence, so let's look at some numbers. Between a 20-year period from 1980 to the year 2000, the number of public housing units decreased by 1 million. Now, what do you think happened to population size during that same time? Do you think it also decreased, which would then explain why the number of public housing units decreased? Or do you think the population was still growing? Well, when we look at it, the number of people that actually would qualify, who would need public housing, the number of people who are low income, actually went up by 2 million during that same period of time. So we're talking about a 3 million housing unit deficit during this period of time from the 1980s to the 2000s. 1 million fewer units and 2 million more people. So let's take a look at an example of a public housing project that was established in Chicago. And these are the Robert Taylor homes. And the Robert Taylor homes were completed in 1962 on the south side of Chicago. Now, if we go back to the urban models that we discussed in class, if you recall, the models of North American land use were largely based on, either directly or loosely based on, the city of Chicago. And remember that we looked at the concentric zone model for the city of Chicago at that time in the 1920s when Ernest Burgess established it. And remember, there was the Black Belt. And the Black Belt was an area of Chicago where 75% of the city's African American population lived. And it was one of the poorest parts of the city. To give some context to that, we've used a lot of different characteristics to talk about development throughout the year. So we know that one of those characteristics that defines development is infant mortality rate. Well, the infant mortality rate in the Black Belt was 16% higher than anywhere else in Chicago. So not only was it low income, but developmentally it was behind other areas in an MDC. And so the Robert Taylor homes were constructed to provide a public housing for people living in Chicago, specifically on the south side of Chicago, all right, near where the Black Belt was located. And it was 28 16-story buildings that housed nearly 30,000 people. Now, one of the accounts that I've read regarding the Robert Taylor homes said that the project itself, those buildings, were only designed to house 11,000 people, which means that by the end, it was housing nearly triple the population that it was intended for. Now, there were a lot of different factors that led to the decline of the Robert Taylor home. Poor planning, lack of opportunity, crime, but there's other factors as well. Lack of services, lack of jobs, the fact that it was a food desert. All of these different things contribute to this. Now, again, let's provide some context. Let's give some data. We talked about crime as one of the contributing factors that led to the decline of the Robert Taylor homes. The Chicago Housing Authority said that on a daily basis, there was $45,000 worth of drug deals taking place in the Robert Taylor housing project. On a daily basis, $45,000 worth of drug deals taking place. Now, part of the reason for that, is that unemployment in the Robert Taylor homes were near 95%. And so all of these different factors together led to the fact that the Robert Taylor homes were not successful. It was not a successful public housing project for the people that were living there. It did not create an opportunity for people to improve their lot in life. And so the area has been demolished and is slated for redevelopment. I'm sure now at this point it has been redeveloped or is in that process. Now, we mentioned a few minutes ago that filtering was the opposite of gentrification, because students in the past have struggled with, okay, what's the difference between filtering and gentrification? Remember that filtering was as more affluent families move out, lower income families fill in those areas. That was filtering. Gentrification is the opposite of that. Here's the definition. The movement into the inner portions of American cities of middle and upper income people who replace low income populations, rehabilitate the structures they occupied, and change the social character of the neighborhood. Where filtering was more affluent families moving out and the building over time deteriorating, gentrification is more affluent families moving in and fixing the deterioration over time. All right? So it's the opposite. Okay, gentrification and filtering are essentially the opposite of one another. All right? And so low-income areas tend to attract certain groups of people, because it's not all middle and upper income people. It attracts certain groups of people for a number of different reasons. The fact that the residences might be a little bit bigger because they were constructed at a time when there was more space before expanded. More stable construction. They might be cheaper as far as single-family homes go. They might be more attractive in terms of their architectural design, the aesthetics of the area. It might have unique characteristics of historical time periods or times that have passed. And another big reason are that the groups of people are attracted to the downtown area and the fact that this is in close proximity to the central business district. Because remember, we've said that the lower income areas tend to be near the CBD. So gentrification and the moving in of middle and higher income groups to this downtown area might be because they work downtown. It might be for some of the services that are provided downtown. It might be for entertainment reasons. Hey, now let's talk about the groups that are doing this. So several of the groups you can see listed below: yuppies, sinks, dinks, empty nesters. Really, what all of these groups have in common is that they have fairly limited or no family obligations, and they tend to have higher incomes. So let's go through each group and identify what they are. Yuppies, these are young urban professionals, all right? Younger people, they're now working. A lot of times they're college educated, and so they're living in the downtown area. Sinks, dinks. Sinks are single income with no kids. Dinks are dual income households with no kids. And then empty nesters are older parents whose children have left the nest. And so these are all individuals that have fairly limited family obligations. They're not as concerned with some of the issues that we talked about in the inner city before. We talked about the fact that the schools tend to be more rundown. These individuals aren't as concerned with that because they don't have those same family obligations that they might be concerned about. And so they're drawn to the inner city for other reasons: nightlife, jobs, different things like that. Now, this concept can be a little more controversial because what ends up happening is that middle and higher income families move in, or I should say groups, because they're really not families. Okay? Individuals or groups move in. They fix things up and the property values go up. So the big question is, what is the controversial element to this? And the question is, and I'll pose this question to you: is this to the benefit or the detriment of the people who are already living there? So here's the thing to consider. If property values are going up, this works very well for people who own their own properties, because then when they sell it for more than they bought it for. Property values have gone up. But what kind of housing do we tend to see in the inner city? Is it a lot of single-family detached homes that people go in and buy? No, we largely see a lot of apartments, people renting. So as those property values go up, what we typically see as well is that rent goes up as well. And part of the reason that apartment buildings are largely clustered in lower income areas is that it spreads the cost of those higher valued areas across multiple families to keep those prices lower. So if the rents go up, lower income families might be unable to pay for that, and they might have to find an area with rent that hasn't exceeded their budget. So, as we often do, let's bring it back to the local. So this is the downtown project, an area that to some could be labeled gentrification, to others could be labeled urban redevelopment. And you'll have to kind of make your own decision. That's not what I'm here to do. So as we talk about this, let's kind of see what we've got. This is the downtown project, and this is just one element of that, and that is Container Park. And this is located on the east side of Fremont Street. So you have the Fremont Street Experience, and then you have Fremont East, and part of that is Container Park. Part of the downtown project is headed up by Tony Hsieh, who is the CEO of Zappos. And what Tony Hsieh did is he relocated the headquarters of Zappos to downtown Las Vegas, downtown on Fremont Street, and it was a huge win for downtown Las Vegas. East Fremont, as you can see here, has been redeveloped. It's more walkable. There's new restaurants. There's new shops. It attracts younger people. So the big question that I ask right now is this a positive thing or is this a negative thing? It's an opinion, and an opinion for you to formulate. So what do you think? And why? All right. So we're moving away from MDCs, and now we're going to talk about LDCs and squatter settlements. All right. The United Nations quotes that there are about 175 million people living in squatter settlements now. However, a different source also cites it, also from the United Nations, cites it at 880 million. So that's a big disparity. All right. And about 43% of an LDC's urban population are living in these squatter settlements. Remember that these are the lowest income areas, a lot of times on the periphery of cities, where people don't own or rent and they erect homemade structures. And they go by a wide variety of names: barrios, favelas in Latin America, some of the more common ones, shanty towns and townships in sub-Saharan Africa. Slums is a term that you will see used most often, I would think, even more often than squatter settlements. But squatter settlements is the term that we see in AP Human Geography, so we have to make sure that we're familiar with that. A lot of times on the periphery of the city, and people will build these structures with whatever they can find. If that's cardboard, wood boxes, crushed cans, corrugated metal is a big one, as we're going to see. These areas have very limited, if any, services. Schools, paved roads, telephones, sewers. Since people don't own the land, nor do they rent, there's no tax revenue necessarily coming from these areas. And since a lot of people are employed informally or illegally, because we do see a lot of drugs and violence in these areas, there's, again, not any tax revenue coming from this to provide these services. And since people are living there illegally, there's kind of this disparity. And what was really interesting, a few years ago, when the World Cup and the Olympics were coming to Brazil, it made international news that the Brazilian police said, okay, we're going to go into the favelas. Because, again, they weren't going in there before. These areas were very, very dangerous, and so the police just didn't go into them. And can you imagine if the police said, sorry, that area is too dangerous, we're not going to go in and police that area? That was what was happening in Brazil. That was happening in the favelas of Brazil. Now, I think that for this topic, it can be more compelling to show you the squatter settlements rather than just talk about them. So let's take a look. So this is a squatter settlement in India, and you can clearly see that this was an area that was not planned, that just kind of popped up. There's a large pipe running down the middle that the child is walking on. And you can see it's built with whatever people can find. Another one in India. In this one, you can see the corrugated metal, which is something that is used for a lot of homemade structures. A lot of areas that are in squatter settlements, you'll see a lot of corrugated metal because it's fairly durable. So it's used as siding on houses, it's used as roofs on houses to try and protect people from the elements. In the Philippines, again, you can see from this image that these structures are built with whatever people can find. And what many people might consider trash, for people in squatter settlements, this might be protection from the elements. This might mean the difference in survival. In South Africa, a lot of times the terms that we will see used are shanty towns or townships. And so you can see this area in South Africa. And one thing that I'd like to show you guys in class is that in South Africa, there's actually a resort that is modeled after a shanty town, where more affluent people can come and stay in this hotel that's modeled after a squatter settlement and can live like people in squatter settlements live. But I'll show you some of the images. I'll show you the commercial for this resort shanty town. And we'll kind of discuss some of the commentary with this and what kind of message it sends. In Brazil, a lot of times these favelas are built on the most marginal land on the outskirts of the city. And a lot of times these areas are very, very hilly. All right, the terrain changes. So they're built into the hillsides. And it is not uncommon, especially during the rainy season, where landslides will come in and destroy entire sections of these favelas and kill many, many people, destroy their homes, and they have to begin all over again. And for our final image tonight, this one also in Brazil. This image, I think, is really important to see the juxtaposition, the side-by-side nature of the very wealthy on one side and the very poor on the other. Now, if you remember, we did our Walled World web quest, and in Brazil, they talked about these communities, Alphaville being one of them, where these walls were built to separate the rich on the inside and the poor on the outside. So we're going to discuss this a little bit more in class. We're going to see it in a couple different videos as we watch. So keep this in mind as we discuss. I'll see you guys back in class.